Hello, I'm Samantha Lewis with Cambridge Health Tech Institute, and I am at the 10th Annual BioIT World Conference in Expo. Today I'm speaking with Jason Stowe, who is the CEO of Cycle Computing. Cycle Computing has been working to create solutions for companies to securely and effectively manage high-volume workloads. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today, Jason. My first question for you is, how would you describe the role of cloud computing in life sciences?
Well, so cloud impacts a lot of different sides of businesses. It impacts the back-end offices where your email is managed, software as a service in general. But the areas that we focus on key are in the science areas themselves. So the underlying science that is done to identify potential drug candidates or identify genes, determine expression of genes, simulate clinical trials. These are the areas that we spend most of our time. And so we see cloud enabling agility that was not possible before. So essentially users can access resources by the hour, be able to pay for what they use, and do science that was totally impossible up until very recently, because buying internal infrastructure is a very expensive proposition. It's hard to buy and manage this kind of computing power in-house. And now it makes it basically is very accessible. It's been democratized because I can get servers from, for example, Amazon Web Services by the hour whenever I need them. And that's a very advantageous thing. So agility is definitely one of them. I guess the other area that we see a lot of impact is most definitely in cost for very bursty workloads. So a lot of times scientific research happens around ideas, and when someone has an idea, they want to run a certain set of calculations around it, understand the science better, and then they don't have to run anymore for a while. And those kind of bursty use cases, cloud really helps with, because you can get the resources only when you need them and not pay for them when you don't need them. So it's been a huge benefit for life sciences in general.
Yeah. And how do you think that cloud changes how computational science is done? Obviously, it has a huge impact, and you work with that directly. So could you please address that?
Sure, absolutely. So we do what we call utility supercomputing. So Cycle Computing is essentially the leading provider of software that enables people to have utility supercomputers whenever they're needed. So it doesn't matter if you're using 50 to 1,000 cores on a day-to-day basis, and then eventually need a 50,000 core environment to run a particular analysis. We actually just announced one that we did with Schrodinger, who had a drug design team that was working in concert with Nimbus Discovery. It's a biotech startup, and essentially they were looking at a target that's affiliated with cancer activity, and they wanted to be able to identify molecules that might eventually turn into leads, that might eventually turn into treatments a long way down the road. But they needed better tools in order to be able to do this. The problem is that their internal cluster, you have several hundred cores, and it's very difficult to be able to run this kind of science on that small infrastructure. You generally end up limiting your problem to the amount of infrastructure you have in-house to run it on. So instead of asking the real question, the one that you need to ask, you ask what you think you can run on your local environment in a couple hours, which is normally pretty limited. So essentially what we were able to do was spin up a 50,000 core monster that ran across all of the different regions inside of AWS. We had machines in Japan, Singapore, Brazil, Portland, North California, Virginia, and the EU operating on this one problem on behalf of a researcher at Schrodinger, which is a 120-person company. So essentially for 3 hours, he did this impossible science that he never would have been able to do before. We did 12 and a half compute years worth of computation in that 3-hour window, and he got results that he never would have been able to get before for $5,000 an hour. And that's basically using a $20 to $25 million supercomputer for 3 hours, turning it on, turning it off, and the total bill was about $5,000 an hour at peak. So it really makes it accessible to anybody. Anybody with an NSF grant, any university researcher, any small startup, any large corporation can now access massive compute in the cloud that they'd never have access to before, thanks to our software and the infrastructure provided by AWS. So we're very excited about that. Cycle Cloud has gotten a lot of interest in life sciences, specifically around this use case and being able to run calculations quickly that were impossible before. So it's very exciting.
It sounds like this technology is really going to revolutionize the way that people do research. And you mentioned that a lot of this is data-intensive computing. And how is Cycle Computing working to remedy any challenges that you may have with that mass amount of data?
Yeah, so we need a lot of data to feed. When you have 50,000 cores running, there's generally at least tens of gigabytes, if not tens of terabytes, involved with the processing. So essentially, what we have is several software technologies that are very interesting, regardless of the transport. So there's a lot of algorithms like Aspera and technologies like Aspera and Riverbed and an open source one called FTT that allow you to efficiently use your network to move data around. The piece that we've specialized in a lot is data scheduling. So understanding that the science you want to run needs these pieces of data in order to execute. Moving it to a remote location so it can be executed, moving the results back and making that seamless to the end user so the end user doesn't have to know about the data movement involved. So we think data movement has been, especially in an application-aware way, is very important because if we're going to take advantage of large amounts of resources across lots of different environments, my internal environment, the cloud, etc., we need to be able to plan and move that data very easily. And the other things that we work on a lot are around how do we access data in a highly efficient, highly parallel manner. So we've done a lot of work to make sure that we can feed 50 cores or 50,000 cores with the data required in order to run the analysis that the scientist needs. So that's been definitely another area that we're actively working on in terms of enabling science and computational science in this environment.
Great. So my last question will zoom out a little bit and talk more about cloud computing as a whole. Where do you see the field going in the next 5 years or so?
Well, so I guess I would start by saying, we're in an age of simulation happened in the 1980s and later, 1970s and later, where we simulated things on a computer before we ever did them. So it doesn't matter whether you were doing computer-aided design for products, for medical devices, or molecular modeling for drug design. We simulate what's going to happen in advance of it actually happening. We've entered into an age of analytics where people are trolling through lots of transactional data or social data or publication data for papers, academic papers and research papers. And these are commonly known as big compute and big data. And so big compute and big data are here. They're definitely here to stay. There's a lot of simulation and there's a lot of analytics being run at really large scales. I think over the next 5 years, it's going to be very interesting, the interplay between the two of these, where right now we use tools like Hadoop and big data environments to analyze what happened in a given situation. So picking up on analytics about how people felt about a particular brand or whether or not a particular disease target was associated with other targets in a set of publications. These kinds of big data problems are interesting, but they're interesting on historical information. I'm interested to see how that plays into simulation because like any pendulum, it swings back and forth over time. And we're definitely in a big data time right now. 5 years from now, it may be the interplay of big data and big simulation that are kind of important. So that we think is going to be very exciting. I also don't think people are going to own clusters, HPC environments, in the same way that they do today. We have, just by this 50,000 core use case alone, we can illustrate giving individual users far more power than they would ever have access to otherwise for very short periods of time to run strategic analysis and strategic science. I think that's going to only continue. We've been doing this for about 5 years and we've just turned the corner where people start to realize that this is actually a really useful tool. So it'll take another 5 years and it'll be completely mainstream. You'd never buy a cluster as a department, hopefully down the road. Our anticipation is that bandwidth will continue to get better. People will house their data in the cloud. They'll analyze it at massive scale in the cloud and we'll be able to do more innovative, better science because of it. That's what we think.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It's very exciting what Cycle Computing is doing. It's very exciting what you were able to do with Schrodinger. Again, I was speaking with Jason Stowe, who is the CEO of Cycle Computing, and I'm Samantha Lewis with Cambridge Health Tech Institute at the 10th Annual BioIT World Conference and Expo. Thank you.